During the past week, we have seen something that we haven't seen for some time, and that is large crowds. Throughout the coronavirus pandemic, people across the world have been discouraged from meeting in large numbers. But over the past week, we've seen vast numbers of people coming together, both here in the UK and across the Atlantic. They have come together in protest following the death of George Floyd. His death has sparked, or perhaps reignited, a deep-seated feeling of injustice amongst many people, and this, they believe, is the time to express it. But as often happens on such occasions, there is a spectrum of people in those crowds. And amidst the many who genuinely and sincerely and peacefully want to express their opinion, there is the small minority who see it as an opportunity to exploit the moment and to exploit the crowds for other purposes. Within the crowd, there are differences. Differences in motives, differences in priorities, differences in agenda. That is always the case when you get a large crowd gathering together, and that was certainly the case in Jesus' day. Now, if you've been with us over recent weeks, then you'll know that we've been working our way through Matthew chapter 8. It's a chapter that records events following Jesus' famous Sermon on the Mount, and as in previous chapters of Matthew's Gospel, there is still a large crowd following Jesus. For example, in the closing verses of chapter 4, we are told that as a result of his teaching and healing ministry, news about him spread, and large crowds from Galilee, the Decapolis, Jerusalem, Judea, and the region across the Jordan followed him. At the close of chapter 7, following Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, there is still a crowd, and they are amazed at his teaching. In chapter 8, verse 16, we read of many people coming to Jesus for healing. And when we get to chapter 8, verse 18, we discover that the crowd is still there. The difference this time, however, is that Jesus is now going to leave the crowd. Verse 18 reads, when Jesus saw the crowd around him, he gave orders to cross to the other side of the lake. He decides to leave the crowd behind and make his way to the other side of Lake Galilee. And as he does so, two people within the crowd express a desire to go with him. And what we have in verses 18 to 22 is a record of their request and a record of Jesus' response to it. And as we look at these verses, we learn two important lessons about following Jesus. The first being in verses 18 to 20, and there we see the need to consider the cost before following Jesus. The need to consider the cost before following Jesus. Having heard Jesus announce his intention to leave the area, a teacher of the law, we are told in verse 19, came to him and said, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." Now, when this man is described as a teacher of the law or as a scribe in some translations, it means that he was a teacher of the Old Testament law. And therefore, this was a man who knew his Old Testament scriptures and probably knew them very well. And amongst those scriptures that he would have been familiar with were passages that looked forward to the coming of God's Messianic King. For example, he would have been familiar with passages such as Isaiah 35 and Isaiah 61, passages that looked forward to some of the great things that God's King would do and some of the great powers that God's King would demonstrate. And having seen and heard Jesus over recent days and weeks, he has come to the conclusion that this Jesus might just possibly be the one that the Old Testament prophets were looking forward to. And can I emphasize that he was perfectly correct in coming to such a conclusion. Through his exceptional authority, through his divine authority demonstrated in both his teaching and his miracles, Jesus has shown throughout these chapters that he is the long-awaited Messianic King, and so this teacher of the law is correct in identifying Jesus as God's King. But where this teacher of the law is mistaken is in his understanding of what kind of king Jesus has come to be. Like most of his fellow Jews, he would have been expecting a king whose coming would have been accompanied by great displays of power and prestige and popularity. And having witnessed the recent miracles of Jesus and having seen the increasingly large crowd that's following Jesus, he decides that now is the time to jump on the Jesus bandwagon, as it were, and enjoy all the benefits that come with following this Jesus. This man has decided that now is the time to get on the inside track, as it were, so that when Jesus' kingdom is fully recognised and finally established, he will be in prime position to share in the power and the popularity that would characterise that kingdom. And so on that basis, he makes a quick and a sudden commitment to follow Jesus wherever he goes. And what is Jesus' response to his commitment? Verse 20. Jesus replied, "Foxes have holes, and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." One consequence of the recent lockdown is that the wildlife has had plenty of peace and quiet, so much so that they are venturing into new territory. For example, we've seen pictures of wild goats in the centre of Llandudno. We've seen pictures of a fox walking along Downing Street, and during this past week we have seen pictures of ospreys nesting once again in Loch Arkaig. 2,000 years on, and Jesus' words are still true. Foxes have holes, and birds of the air have nests. But, says Jesus, speaking about himself, in sharp contrast to them, the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. Can you picture what Jesus is saying here? The animals and birds of the created world will always find a place that they can call home. They'll always do that. Whereas when the creator of this world stepped into his creation, there were times when he didn't even have a suitable place to rest his head at night. Contrary to what this man and many others of his generation thought, Jesus' time on this earth would not be one big procession of power and pomp and prestige and popularity. No. Far from it. Yes, there would be times when he was popular, as we've seen in the preceding verses, but there would also be other times when he was extremely unpopular. There would be times when he would experience the ridicule and the rejection of this world, and consequently there would be times when he would experience poverty and suffering. And if that is the lack of prestige and popularity and prosperity that Jesus sometimes experienced, then you can be sure that there may very well be times when his followers will experience something similar. You see, the reason Jesus said this to this man was not to gain some sympathy from him, but to warn him about the realities of following Jesus in this world. Because don't forget, as Jesus would say on another occasion, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. And so if Jesus' pathway on this earth was marked at times by ridicule and rejection, poverty and pain, then those who follow him need to be prepared for the same. That is the cost of following Jesus. And so rather than make some quick, rash decision to follow Jesus wherever he goes, this man ought to pause and consider what may very well be involved in following this Jesus. It was something this man ought to consider back then, and it is something that you and I still need to consider today. I say that because it's still possible for us to make a quick, rash decision to follow Jesus without knowing and without considering just what that might involve. It's possible. Because as was the case back then, there can be enormous misunderstanding as to what Jesus is actually accomplishing in this world. On a selective reading of a few selective texts, we might come to the conclusion that Jesus' mission is to make our lives in this world comfortable and cosy. For example, having read the first half of Matthew 8, and having heard about all the sickness he cured and all the pain and misery he eradicated from the lives of people back then, we might be tempted to think, wow, I wouldn't mind having that kind of Jesus in my life. If Jesus' mission in this world is to make us healthy and wealthy and perpetually happy, then sign me up, you may be thinking to yourself. Sadly, that is how Christianity is often presented in our world today. The result being that many people do sign up, only to find themselves bitterly disappointed and severely disillusioned at some later stage in life. And in their disappointment and disillusionment, they will tell you, it isn't the Christianity that we were promised. It wasn't what it said it was on the tin. It wasn't what we were sold. That is because they were sold a view of Christianity and a view of Jesus that is contrary to what we find in the Bible. As we discovered a couple of weeks ago from the previous verses in Matthew 8, the reason for Jesus coming into this world was not to eradicate the effects of sin from our lives in the present. Instead, the purpose of his coming was to deal with the fundamental problem of sin, so that those who trust in him might be rescued from the frightening and damning consequences of sin throughout eternity. That is the salvation which he came to secure. And in order to do so, his life on this earth was a pathway of rejection and suffering. And what he is warning this would-be follower in verse 20 is that following him may very well involve the same. And so that being the case, don't make a rash decision to follow Jesus on the basis of verses 1 to 17 of Matthew 8 alone. Instead, read on to verse 22, because in doing so you will get a fuller understanding of what his life was like in this world, and you'll get a clearer understanding of what it means to follow him in this world. That is the need to consider the cost before following Jesus. Secondly, verses 21 and 22, and there we see the need to consider our priorities before following Jesus, the need to consider our priorities before following Jesus. As you read through these chapters of Matthew's Gospel, you discover that the word disciple can be used in a variety of ways. It's probably fair to say that on hearing that word, we usually think of those 12 men who followed Jesus here, there and everywhere throughout his 3 years of public ministry. But in these chapters, the word disciple is sometimes used of people who are following Jesus in a much looser and much less committed manner. And so when we read in verse 21 of another disciple speaking to Jesus, we need to remember that both this man and the previous one were amongst a vast number of people who were following Jesus for a vast number of reasons, some of them more out of curiosity rather than wholehearted commitment. And it's from that vast spectrum of followers that these two men have appeared. That's why these two men were called disciples. That's what these two men had in common. Where these two men differed was that whereas the previous one was too rash in declaring his allegiance to Jesus, this second one is too reluctant to demonstrate an undivided allegiance to Jesus. On hearing of Jesus' intention to leave for the other side of the lake, this man also indicates a desire of some kind to follow him, but not just yet. Not just yet. Verse 21 tells us, another disciple said to him, Lord, first let me go and bury my father. And in response, Jesus says, verse 22, follow me and let the dead bury their own dead. In first century Middle Eastern culture, it was normal practice to bury someone within 24 hours of them dying. The hot climate demanded a quick burial. But it is unclear whether this man is expressing a desire to bury his father who has already just died, or whether he is expressing a desire to continue looking after his father until he dies. Either way, this man is expressing a desire and a concern to do what he thinks is right and is good for his father. And in many ways, we might say that it was a commendable concern that he has for his father. And so that being the case, we may think that the response of Jesus, we may find his response on this occasion to be rather cold and harsh and unreasonable and unsympathetic. Follow me and let the dead bury their own dead. Well, the first thing to emphasize here is what Jesus is not saying. Jesus is not encouraging some crass disrespect for parents. The Old Testament law was crystal clear on the responsibility of children towards their parents, and nowhere does Jesus contradict that law. Jesus is not saying that if we become followers of him, then we won't be able to attend our parents' funeral. That is not what Jesus is saying here. And so what is he saying? Well, don't forget that Jesus, even if you read the Sermon on the Mount, you'll discover it. Jesus often spoke with striking language. And you may even want to say shocking language at times. And he did so in order to make his point. And the point that Jesus is making here, and he'll make it again in chapter 10, is that if we are going to follow Jesus, then he must become our number one priority in life, and he must be our number one allegiance in life, even before that of our immediate family. That is what Jesus is demanding of this would-be follower of his. But from what we are told, it appears that he has been too slow and too reluctant in demonstrating such an undivided allegiance to Jesus. Well, on the one hand, there are obviously some things about Jesus that he admires. And there are some aspects of following Jesus that appeal to him. But on the other hand, he likes the loyalties and the allegiances that he's already got in life. And consequently, there is this tension over who or what is going to occupy the number one place in his life. Who or what is going to be the supreme object of his love and his loyalty. Is it going to be Jesus? Or is it going to be someone or something else? That is the tension that this man is faced with. And it may just be that that is a tension that you can identify with to some extent this morning. Having heard about Jesus, there is perhaps a lot about him that appeals to you. For example, It may be that as you have read his famous Sermon on the Mount, you realise that what he's saying is true. You recognise that his diagnosis of the human heart, and therefore of your heart, is so perceptive that you cannot help but think that this is someone to be believed. Or it may be that having read about the miracles of Jesus, you cannot help but think that this is someone who did and does possess divine authority. As you read about the death upon the cross and his resurrection from the grave, you are persuaded that this man was and is who he claimed to be, the Son of God, the Saviour of sinners. And so there is much about Jesus that appeals to you. And there are certain things about following Jesus that appeal to you. For example, you long to know that forgiveness that only Jesus can give. You long to know that clearing and that cleansing of the conscience that we read about in our first reading from Hebrews chapter 10. You long to know that cleansing of the conscience that only Jesus can provide through his death on the cross. You long to know that peace with God that only he can bring. You long to know that confidence concerning death and that assurance concerning eternity that only Jesus can provide you with. It may be that you see such things in the lives of friends or family members who are Christians, and you long for those things to be true of you. And what is more, they have told you how they can be true of you. They've told you that it's through turning from your sin and trusting in Jesus that those tremendous blessings can be yours. It sounds appealing, does it not? And yet, there is something, or perhaps someone in your life that is preventing you from giving your undivided love and loyalty and allegiance to Jesus Christ this morning. It may be a relationship which you treasure, but which you know is contrary to the teaching of Jesus as found in the Bible. It may be some sin that you enjoy so much that the thought of giving it up and turning your back on it is hard to imagine. Or it may simply be your own selfish, self-centered lifestyle, and the thought of placing someone else at the centre of your agenda in life and of your ambitions in life is challenging, to say the least. The thought of giving that place of supreme authority in your life to someone else and allowing someone other than yourself to call the shots in your life is one that you see as a threat to all that you have and do and enjoy most about life. Like this man in Matthew chapter 8, there are some things about Jesus that you like, and there are some things about following Jesus that appeal to you. But there are other people and other things that occupy the number one place in your life at the moment, and your priority in life is to give your love and your loyalty and your allegiance to them. And if that is the case, then the words of Jesus to these two men in Matthew 8 are extremely relevant to you this morning. If you are thinking about becoming a follower of Jesus, then before rushing to sign up, you, like the first man, need to first consider the cost involved in following him. And like the second man, you also need to consider your priorities in life. I say that because the response of Jesus to the second man indicates that what Jesus asks and what Jesus demands of any would-be followers is that he becomes Lord and Master of their lives, and in doing so becomes the supreme object of their love, their loyalty and their allegiance. Anything less than that will not do as far as Jesus is concerned. And in response, you may be thinking to yourself, oh dear, It sounds a lot. It sounds a lot that Jesus is demanding of us, does it not? Yes, it does sound a lot. And it is a lot. But what you have to remember is who it is that is demanding such allegiance this morning and what he has done to obtain such allegiance. This is the creator and sustainer of the universe. This is the eternal Son of God. This is the long-awaited Messianic King of the Old Testament Scriptures. And out of love for sinful and selfish rebels like you and me, he has come from the splendour of heaven into the poverty of this world. He has gone to the cross, and he has suffered the judgment of God that sinners like you and me deserve to suffer throughout eternity. And did you know that by his grace and through the heart-changing, life-changing power of his death, do you know that there are sinful, selfish, self-centered sinners throughout history and throughout our world who have come to the conclusion that 12 men within that vast crowd came to many years ago, the conclusion that millions have come to since then, and that is the conclusion, to use the words of a Christian from 100 years ago, if Jesus Christ be God and died for me, then no sacrifice can be too great for me to make for him. In view of who this Jesus is, and in view of what he has done for sinners like you and me, will you do what Jesus demanded of these two men in Matthew chapter 8? Will you count the cost? Will you make him your number one priority in life? Will you follow this Jesus?